All right, welcome. I'm Lindsay Grace, and I will be moderating this panel for us. We have some great guests. Just a quick introduction from me. We'll go through some introductions for the rest of the panel, and then we have a variety of really interesting questions around this topic. So I'm Lindsay Grace. I've written 70 plus book chapters, books, and peer-reviewed articles around games and game design, very active in the social impact game space. Most recently edited and co-authored with some folks who are actually here, a book on Black game studies, and really excited to have a conversation about what this topic means and how we explore it. So I'll just go over and we'll do panelist introductions. And we will start basically looking for our panelists to sort of tell us who they are, what they do, what they're most proud of, and what their relationship to games of the African diaspora is. So kind of talk about your own work in 2 or 3 minutes. So let's start with Aaron.
Hey everybody, my name is Aaron Trammell. I'm an assistant professor at UC Irvine, and I'm thrilled to be here on this panel. So I'm the strange person who works on tabletop games and hobby games instead of digital games. And so when I talk about what I do, I actually like to pitch the 2 books that I have coming out next year, which I'm really excited about, because they kind of tell 2 parts of the same story. And the first part of that story is how in North America, hobby games and tabletop games have been sort of historically part of white culture and white communities until the moment that we're living in right now, where they're rapidly diversifying and people of color are coming in and really changing the scene. And then the other book I'm working on tells the second half of that story. And that is in game studies, and those of us who work in games, we talk about play a lot. But the theories of play that we work with are really indebted to a lot of European philosophy. And so the second book is a book that really tries to tell the story about how play, we might find a theory of play that centers itself around this sort of BIPOC experience as opposed to an experience that's about white European folks. And so that's really where my work is, right? Like I'm critically looking at these histories of play, these histories of games, and trying to think through in these histories how they're racial histories, first of all, and also how we might look to the future and produce histories that are more inclusive of folks from the African diaspora moving forward. So thrilled to be here and looking forward to having this wonderful conversation with the rest of the panel.
Excellent, thank you. Nyambura?
Hi everybody, really also thrilled to be here. Aaron, I have actually a game for you to check out, which is the Monopoly version, the Nairobi version of Monopoly called Kumiliki, which actually just came out recently. And I don't want to define recently, I'm thinking about 5 years. And it's quite fascinating because as a young person, we played Monopoly and it was British Monopoly, right? So it was Mayfair and all of that. And to actually now see that a new generation is playing Monopoly, and we can discuss capitalism and land ownership later. But in Nairobi and looking at property in Nairobi and the importance of cultural references in play, your own cultural references is so important. So I'm going to send that your way. So again, thrilled to be here. I am Nyambura Waruingi. I'm the founder and creative director of Akoia and Company. It's a company that I founded because I just felt that a lot of work that I was doing and that I was interested in that would center Black and African and diasporic communities was not a part of the production space I was in, and that was in Montreal, Canada. So I picked up and left and decided to start a company, a creative enterprise in Nairobi, and really develop a global company out of Africa and see how that works out. And it has been really great. One of the things that I'm really proud of is how I've participated and worked in the new media space. So my entry into gaming is not that I was a gamer for any long time or that I was, a game writer or game designer, was because I really wanted to create games and narrative games that had cultural references to ourselves and our experiences. And so that comes with the game The Ground Screams to Whisper, which is an XR experience that looks at the relationship to land and independence and Kenyan female freedom fighters, and how coffee is tied to land and the imperial project of occupying Kenya and using its resources, of which women were very much tied to because they were the agriculturalists. They're the ones who grew the coffee. So if you love Kenyan coffee, guess what? That's its beginning. But the story around it is really looking at how this women resisted and how they actually funded some of our founding fathers to go off to England and get our independence, so to speak. So that's my entry point into gaming. Not a traditional or conventional gamer in any way, but very much a storyteller that's looking at different ways of expressing and including different voices and stories and different histories, and particularly around cultural references that are our own. So really thrilled to be here. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Carl.
All right, good. Greetings, everybody. My name is Carl Bernardo. I have been serving as Executive Director of Black in Gaming, which is an organization that's an advocacy organization to get African Americans to the video game industry since 2018. We were active. We've been the organization around since 2002, but we became a formal foundation last year. I am the co-founder of, through that experience, I'm the co-founder of the Black Video Game Awards. So we have been, it's our 6th year. So we've given out awards to various people in the industry for their activism, their relevancy, their excellence in design, excellence in artistry, last couple of years. And then I am also teach. So I teach video game design, filmmaking, screenwriting, and animation for the last 11 years to various different organizations. One of my most important contributions to the industry, I believe, is I do a lot of cultural consulting with companies about their character representation. So I will go in and help them understand if the characters are not relevant to the industry or relevant to the culture they're trying to represent, and give them notes and foundations on like how to change that character to make them more relevant. I've done that quite a few companies, EA as an example, Capcom is another example. And my chief goal in the industry is to help us to be better represented behind the camera, which is in the industry as far as working for a company, being an entrepreneur, creating your own game studios, and in front of the camera, which is getting rid of stereotypes and assumptions about video games characters as they're depicted. One simple fact of this is 73% of African Americans would consider themselves game intelligent, meaning they either play games or they know somebody that plays games, and they've used a system console. But African Americans are only 2% of the industry itself. So we are underrepresented as far as making games, but overrepresented as far as consumers that consume games.
Thank you. Perfect. And Allan.
So hi, thank you so much for having me. So I'm Allan. I'm based currently in Berlin, Germany, then in Ghana when it gets cold, so I follow the sun, north-south. I'm originally Italian Ghanaian. And I've been in the gaming industry for about a decade, mostly as a game designer. But around 3 years ago, I started my own independent game development studio called Twin Drums. We're kind of partially based here, partially remote. And for me, it was in some way very similar to what Nyambura was describing. So about representation and being able to talk, and tell stories within games that represented my own culture and other parts of the continent and diaspora. So currently I'm working on an indie MMORPG called the Wagado Chronicles, which is a sandbox online role-playing game where you can meet with others, create villages. It's all like very player-driven, so every item in the game, everything you create is done by players. And also, many of the themes too are very quintessentially African. Like you don't have monsters you kill, but it's more spirits and ancestors you deal with in different ways. You have skills like herding, for instance, which you wouldn't see in Eurocentric MMORPGs. So yeah, trying to change the conversation with this, with the Wagado Chronicles, our indie MMO.
Great, thank you. So now that you have a sense for all of our histories and sort of foundation, I'm going to start with some easy questions and we'll get some more complex ones. But generally a core concept here, or a core definition needs to be explored, which is basically what we consider Black games or games of the African diaspora. And is that term Black games appropriate? Everyone can feel free to jump in, but not everyone has to answer. I think it'd be interesting, I'm an academic, but I have a game design career, so I sort of chose some terminology that seemed appropriate. Others have AAA experience, and others have indie experience or art experience. So I'd love to hear it from multiple perspectives. Feel free to jump in.
Okay, everybody's quiet, so I'll go. I think that Black games is a very complex term now, because I think 20 years ago it was trying to get something made like Legend of Zelda, or we would call it Def Jam Vendetta as a Black game. I think now we're having the complexity of indie games versus AAA games. So I think there's two different goals, right? So there's a goal if you're an indie game developer to get your Black game content seen, and then there's AAA developers trying to figure out if their characters, should they support a black protagonist as a game creator? Should they support a Black studio that's going to create games, which means most of the people that own the studio are from the African diaspora? Or is a Black theme? Does need to be a version of Black Panther to be considered a Black game? I think all of them have different various elements of relevance. And then there's also games that people would argue are not representative of the culture, but have Black protagonists, like I think what's it called? Grand Theft Auto as a great example. It had a Black protagonist, but I don't think Black creators would say that's a Black game per se. So there's different kinds of definitions you can look at.
We had discussion about this because I'm based out of Nairobi now, so I'm more African than diasporan at the moment. When before I was more diaspora than I was African. So that also tells you about multiplicity and fluidity of identities, particularly around social constructions like Blackness, whiteness, and everything else. So I think that as an African, primarily as a Kenyan, and when I go into the world, I see myself as an African, and then if I stay long enough in a place that's, which culture, is white and is white supremacist at its founding, I become Black. So that can be very different for people who have been born in those type of countries versus someone who hasn't. So when I was curating No Direct Flight, which was a film festival, a film experience that was looking at Black diaspora and film work, visual arts, new media, and looking at the conversation between Black diasporic type of work and African work. And there was always a problem with terms. Do Africans identify as Black? Somewhat, yes, but if you go to a village, what is a primary way of identification? Probably the ethnicity, probably the tribe, probably the village, probably the clan. So I think, to Carl's point, it is much more nuanced. It is definitely a very complicated term, and I think what my version of what needs to be done is to allow a breathing space in ways that also recognizes that a particular Blackness has become a representation of Blackness, and that comes from the cultural imperial machine that was America, white America, and then the conduit that brought Black culture around the world, where Black culture now is mainstream culture in certain ways, particularly around music and fashion, and there is that, But then how do we open up a space where we are also speaking about, when Allan talks about, even in my work, I'm looking at ancestors. There's a very different way of situating yourself where maybe in African American culture that would maybe come more from the South, more from a Gala community or Louisiana, New Orleans or something like that. So I think it is a really important moment to expand and have the complicatedness of naming as much as we can what we're talking about instead of subsuming it under one term.
Great. I think one of the challenges here is, of course, that naming in some ways actually gives community to something and says, great, when I Google searched games I want to get from the Black community, I looked up Black games, and that was a marketing tactic, and some games sold that way. But at the same time, there's this sort of this challenge in, and as you sort of said, this sort of fluidity or a sense of sort of a version of intersectionality that references the fact that that definition also varies based on the community you're in or the perspective. What then, if I can ask a slightly more complicated question, what then does this particular foci shape the way that we understand social impact in the domain? Are there unique characteristics, or are there things that we might see as a pattern from the community that would actually have some social impact?
Maybe I can try on this, and I feel like it has already come up a couple of times, but I think one thing we have to deal with is just the planet in which we are and how it has treated our people as in the last centuries. And that's something that's very different, for instance, from the way Japanese found themselves, Japanese folks and developers, when they brought their own culture, or or even East Asians in general to some extent, into the world. So sometimes people go like for quick comparisons, like, oh yeah, African inspired games or Black games or inspired games is similar to like what Japanese folks did. But Japan was a colonialist power, and it's not a coincidence that today Japan is so wealthy, and there's everything is connected in that sense. Whereas like Africans and diaspora have not been colonial powers for the most, so, and actually the opposite. So that means that we find ourselves constantly fighting against the flow. And I think there's something, we talk a lot about, cultural appropriation, but I think one thing that maybe we don't hear enough about, I find, is cultural annihilation. There's been like a lot of this too. Like, we're dealing with languages being, disappearing, cities and architecture that have been mostly destroyed. Like now, for the Wagado Chronicles, lots of the cities you can build are based on traditional African architectures and temples and so on. And even many Africans have never seen those architectures. So they look at them and go, what's this? Like, this is actually ancient Ghanaian architecture. And they're like, oh, I'm Ghanaian, I never saw this. Or like, this is a typical shrine from, I don't know, Kenya. It's like, what? I've never seen this before. I didn't even know how. And so it's the amount of erasure, like it's really, really, really deep. And so creating media, and in this case games that are inspired by this, we just have to fight like double, And I see it as like, you see these books behind me, like to be able to create an African fantasy game, I have to do so, and my team is doing so much research. And some of these books are very expensive, or like papers, and some of them cost like hundreds and hundreds of euros or dollars. There's so many barriers. And it really, we're still at a stage in which the system is stacked against us. So I think that's one factor I want to raise.
I want to piggy. I'm sorry.
It's all yours. It's all yours, Aaron.
Do you mind if I? Yeah, I want to piggyback off that, Allan, because I think that the legacy of colonialism looms really large over this definition, and for me, that's the really important and I think spiritual place that I go to when I think of the African diaspora. Right? Is this place that's no place, that's a spiritual place because of the annihilation, because of all the violence that's been wrought on Black people, African people historically. And I think that nothingness, right, is actually a point of solidarity. That's a home that we all have together. And that's really important. And it's in some ways, I think it's a home that we share with other colonized people who aren't necessarily Black, because that's the real history, right? That's the violence that's really produced the situation that we're in right now.
I was going to say that's a really good point, Aaron. I think there's a couple complexities that you have to analyze here, right? The level of understanding of how games actually work, their impact on the culture, and where game ideas come from, right? Game ideas are fairly rooted in European fantasy and sci-fi ideas from other mediums, right, over a course of a number of years, right? And African diaspora did not have this sort of rich history to pull from Tolkien as an example, right, to create their game ideas, right? So like there was a gap between like the cultural landscape of like what games do and how they impact, And I think the African diaspora didn't understand for a long time that kind of legacy. We didn't get like, okay, games have this kind of impact on people's psychology and development. And then we backed into, okay, games are successful. Okay, now we want to be in the game industry because they're successful, but that's an entrepreneurial approach, not a storytelling approach, right? So now we spend lots of time talking about STEM and getting kids into STEAM-related careers, and we're very developed on like the access of the game industry as far as like how we get people into it because we want successful children, as an example, right? But I think the analyzation of like how the actual culture is impacted by games has been a slower conversation. That's, I think, why Allan had to do so much research, right? Because, like, I mean, you start with Octavia Butler as, like, the queen of Afrofuturism, right? But, like, can you even go back further than that? Can you make a game based on the Sundiata myths of, like, you know, can you do that? Can you make, like, we don't even understand yet, like, how to reach back and take a black game and make it culturally effective based on our own mythology. And so I think some of the African people, not the diaspora, the actual African countries have like been able to start doing that more organically. I think that's what Nyambura's argument has been, is that they actually are taking from their lexicon and cultural history, which was Japan did, right? Which the American identity is super complex because our resources of culture are different than the people on the continent, right? Does that make sense?
And there's an interesting tension here I think we should highlight, which is that we both said that there is this sort of pop culture prevalence for certain aspects of the culture, and then other historical aspects of the culture that have either been colonialized, dismissed, destroyed. And so we're trying to balance these as designers or as people who are implementing, and the resources themselves are complicated by academic research and the cost of doing that, or by the way that we document and which historical documents were preserved and which ones weren't. So it's a super fascinating space. A little easier, just so that people have something concrete to grab onto, and then we'll swap over. Can someone share, and perhaps this is what's going to happen next anyway, some examples either of games that you think are sort of favorite or are emblematic, that do something well, so we have some sort of something concrete to consider, or that you wish people fundamentally understood, which we're kind of hinting at. The complexity of making what we'll generally call black games has something to do with X, and so we've said that it has something to do with colonial histories, it has something to do with what is popularized or accepted, and this other history where, say, Tolkien is important to fantasy in games, and we haven't quite had those moments in this community. If people could jump in there, and I want to make sure that it looks like there's another comment as well.
I can definitely.
Well,
Oh,
I
go
just
first.
wanted to dive in. Sorry, Allan. So the conversation that we had before we started recording around, you know, games like, for example, even the funding, understanding the funding of games, right? On the continent, and I'm using it very broadly, and all the Africans who are going to watch this, please forgive me, I'm using Africa very broadly just to talk about funding, and that is the idea, for example, here is where I've had to, and the ground screams to whisper for me becomes a use case of indie, like an indie studio, really going around finding the funding that matches you, looking like a lot of my funding is actually coming out of research work, because a lot of the work is also astrology, which again is, we had our own astrology that apparently is sitting somewhere in a library that I suddenly found access to, but never did as you know, as a young person. You know, there's a whole astronomical society on this continent that I did not know until now because of what I'm interested in. And then looking at funding, so going back to funding, where mostly on the African continent, more often than not, the funding that goes, whether it's creativity, cultural, tech, is mostly geared toward development, changing the lives of 10 million people at a go. So even if you're looking at gaming, or a million people at the least, is how is this solving malaria? How is this solving, reproductive rights? How is it? Nothing in any of the funded countries actually does that, right? So I think there is a greater discussion also how we understand funding the continent that is tied to colonialism and ideas of development, and what we need to concentrate on as Africans, which is getting water to people via game, which I've never understood how that happens, but they will educate me once that game comes out. So it's very important, I think, to, yes, understand, as Aaron, Carl, and Allan have pointed to, the colonial legacy of it all, and to say that there are a lot of people who are making games differently. So even in the thinking around games, what do those look like? They're making games for the mobile, for example. In the rest of the world, we'll say the Western world, for us in Africa, we say the Western world, is that, you're talking about, playing on your, console game, you're talking about, in your headset and stuff like that. Most people have access to a mobile phone. So the question becomes, where are the games accessible? And that, Carl, what you're talking about, accessibility, is also us thinking differently about how we make games, for what platforms and where our audiences are, that then expands access, expands authorship, expands ownership, expands us different ways, and also how you can fund them. That doesn't have to be a AAA game at the beginning, but building a foundation of a gaming vernacular, gaming language, audience development that then gets us to maybe a AAA or whatever else we'll define as we go along.
Excellent, and I think I should give some context to that conversation, which can help us with the next, which is that one of the things we were talking about earlier was this concept, like I literally was in Kuala Lumpur yesterday, and there are initiatives by country to support cultural sort of growth and industry growth that have something to do with identity and culture. And one of the interesting things in this context is that when you're looking broadly at sort of Black people throughout the world, what you're doing is looking at a bunch of different histories that may be unified by some of the themes that we talked about, but that there isn't a central embassy per se, or a central resource that says, you know what, we need to preserve this culture, or we need to be ambassadors of this culture. And the challenge there is, of course, that it could be a very democratizing force. You could have a bunch of people who sort of own it themselves, or it can be a really sort of very federated space where people are saying, I'm doing this for this country, I'm doing this for that country, and maybe losing some of the unifying themes. So really interesting on its own. In terms of questions, does anyone have any examples they want to provide of games they think are doing any of this work well, and maybe talk about why?
So I wanted to mention, first of all, brief comment on Nyambura's topic of funding. I guess that would be a whole other talk, a panel. But even for me as an African European with like more access to Western funding, I must say, like, currently working on a very Black game, I found myself more than once sitting in front of a potential investor or publisher explaining why this is actually not a risk, or why it's not a risk, and being really questioned on this. I think there's a lot of intersectional issues around this, and I think there's still a lot of way to go. It's not as easy as it should be. And Lindsay, on your question, I really want to mention the development team Tiro and Oron Legacy of the Corridon, Cameroonian game.
We gave them an award. Get them an award.
Awesome. Well done. And I think they really deserve it, because they're literally the first to have created a game that gets away from the Eurocentric fantasy world and rather to create fantasy. So I always say, like, they're the first single player, and we're the first multiplayer Afro fantasy game, and I think it's really awesome, especially that they did it completely in Cameroon with very much like almost no industry to support them, and that's really, really hard when you don't have like a whole ecosystem to build upon. So it's very, very impressive. And I think what Carl, you were saying too about like and then Aaron too, on like our background, even as a diaspora, the nothingness, or like Lord of the Rings as being like just the shared understanding of fantasy. I think that's something that we should be changing. I'm literally like working on it, and we should get to a point where, I remember a story once. An old director I had, a white American, told me he traveled to the US, to Europe for the first time as a teenager, and saw like a castle in the UK and was shocked and was like, wow, this is like a fantasy game. This is so awesome, And I thought, we should get to a point where Black folks as well, Black diaspora, can go maybe to Africa or somewhere and see something, a temple, a shrine, and go like, wow, this is like in the games or the books I've read, So I think we should get there. We should get to a point where, they're all equal, but there's still some way to go.
Yeah, so there's some games I always like to recommend that I think are really wonderful, but they are tabletop games because it's me. I'll give one non-tabletop game because I think it's cool too. But there's a game called Harlem Unbound, which is a role-playing game, which is in Lovecraft's Cthulhu universe, but it takes place during the Harlem Renaissance instead. And so and it's got some descriptions of how, racist Lovecraft himself was, and how the game itself is trying to sort of undermine and undo the sort of mythology that he put out there. That's a really, really amazing game, especially one, right, that's playing with these themes of nothingness and oblivion and stuff like that within its own mythology. Another one specific to North America is Steal Away Jordan, which is a role-playing game that's retelling of Beloved. And so in that game, you're a slave working on a plantation, right? And so it's a whole mechanical system trying to understand what that historical experience was like. And I think that's by Julia Bond Ellingbo. That's a really wonderful example. And then the last example I'll give that I think is wonderful is there's a designer called AM Dark, and they made a game called Yay or Nay that I adore. And this game, it's basically Guess Who, but you can play it on your computer, so you play it like with somebody through the internet. So this is my version of a digital game. And in this game, basically, almost all of the pawns that you have on your side of the board are versions of Kanye West. And so the game is kind of exploring stereotypes, because you have all these versions of Kanye West, and you have to describe them, or the one that you're looking to at the other player. And the game's actually about how folks will trip over their words and how they'll make excuses for they're trying to describe to the other player. It's really brilliant in its implementation, how it really pulls this sort of like internal stereotypes that people have out. And again, made by a wonderful black designer. So I think there's a lot of really great games out there, and I think they all play with representation. They play with stereotypes in their own way. But I also want to kind of piggyback off of some of the things that Allan is saying, which is that we should have a space for games that doesn't have to be one that's necessarily distinctly about social justice. That might be the moment we're living in right now. But like, I want games that are black fantasy, that are African diaspora fantasy, that just can be, right? Like, that can stand on their own next to Lord of the Rings and just be that amazing world that's been built.
Excellent. One of the themes that I think, like in my my first book on social impact games, and I'm hearing it here too, is this opportunity, or maybe lack thereof, in games as consumed media in respect to others. So I think generally in academia, we also talk about the sort of ludoliteracy that you're hinting at, this idea that there's something, a way of reading text as games and understanding games or culture very differently. And so games offer this opportunity. Does anyone have any sort of comments, questions, or things they'd like to share around how games as sort of either oriented towards a specific audience or as being produced by a specific audience, what Carla described as sort of being in front of the camera or behind the camera, in the game or in the production of the game, that might be important here. So basically, are there any sort of either social responsibilities or some values in making this kind of media as opposed to making movies or books or, I don't know, scroll tablets?
Don't get rid of the scroll tablets. Carl.
That's when so every other medium has like a social impact, low cost version of itself, right? Like if you look at like movies, documentaries are one of the lowest cost versions of making a movie, but also have the most social impact as far as like telling the story, right? And look at television shows. Same thing, there's a documentary kind of format to that. If you look at like writing a book, like there's every other kind of entertainment medium has like an education model in it that is low cost, right? And so they become the kind of versions of people when people want to have a passion to tell the story about something that's super important, they kind of go to that low cost model. Like, even the documentary Inconvenient Truth is basically a PowerPoint on stage, and like he just told a story, right? But like, gaming's kind of unique in this respect is it's hard to have a low cost gaming choice with social impact in our current format of how we make games, right? Like we've not really been able to do it as a society overall. There's some games that have been amazing, like that. I think there's one about cancer. That Dragon Cancer is a great example of like a low cost game that had a big social impact. And Games for Change is about this, right? But the issue in the African American community is the people that want to make social impact don't run to that medium to do that, right? So they either want to make a high budget game for their social impact, like they want to make a high fantasy game. So like I want to make a Black Legend of Zelda for like 20 years, right? Like, but that cost me $10 million, so I can't do it like that. I have to like do a bunch of stuff to get that ready, right? But on the other side of that is how do I galvanize a team to do a social impact game when a large part of the development community wants to just make cool stuff, right? Because one of the things that's really difficult about games is games are centered around the mechanic, right? Not the story. And so it's a big mistake when people talk about entertainment mediums because it's around the mechanic, you have to make the mechanic give social impact, which is even more difficult than people realize it is. And so like you have to be innovative not only in your cultural innovation, but also in like the way you do the game, the way you implement the game, which is as challenging it is to make culturally impactful.
So I think it's a good way to think about this is to perhaps think about the fact that we recognize that Risk is a game about colonialism.
Yes.
The Monopoly is a model of Georgist economics. And so if we think generally about these sort of these themes that might come out, there's a version of overt social impact where we sell the game on this concept that this is
Yes.
going to be best broccoli you can consume, or there's this sort of the themes that don't get shared or that are unique to the community that are integral. So, I mean, we mentioned Tolkien in the Hobbit series, and it's like, well, that's baked with all kinds of versions of understanding the world that have to do with the author's understanding of the world and class and race. And so I'm curious if people have thoughts about either unique opportunities, missed opportunities within games that might also apply. So there's this sort of like, there's the AAA approach, which is let's make a $10 million game, but there's also, as Aaron's just mentioned, a variety of what we call sort of analog or indie games that have that same kind of impact and message baked into them that aren't about playing it because you know it's a Black game, but instead because it is a game that offers a perspective you may not have seen.
I've seen a couple games that are really interesting about just getting to school. Like, so there's like different versions of, there's like a game jam. So like they'll do, so you have to crash through like 6 different kind of gang neighborhoods to get to school. And like, it's basically a hide and seek game. Like you have to hide from whatever the obstacle is in that neighborhood and if you get caught, you get killed. And then they did different versions where like, even like you go to other countries and you have to cross rivers to get to school. You know, like the whole game is about like showing people like how difficult school actually is just to get to for some people, as an example.
Or Ghettopoly references the complexity of literally just trying to work within a system that
Yes.
has structures against you, understanding the value of public transportation in LA, these sorts of things. Yep.
I think I just wanted to add as well, I very much 100% agree with what Carl said in the last 2 comments. And I think I just want to add the fact that themes also like less visible way to can be very important for games and affect the mechanics and so on. So I feel it's a bit of a spectrum. Like, ideally, I think we talk a lot about games that are very visibly, Black or African or diasporic, which is what I'm working on as well. But I think there's lots of other subtle ways as well. So a game might appear like superficial, maybe visually or so on, like maybe as not especially Black. But then there might be topics related to loss, self-discovery, discrimination, or like survival that can be very much part of our either diasporic or post-colonial experience. And so, for instance, for the Wagado Chronicles, which of course is on top and actually very visibly Black game, we do have a tabletop version. So Aaron, actually, I'm buying on top of this a 5th edition version of the setting, which is for free on our website. And one of the things that you'll see happen straight away when you play the game is that you fall into the world of Wagado with a lot of memory loss. And you try to understand who you are, and with other survivors. And even XP is actually called memories in the Wagado Chronicles because you're kind of rebuilding your memories. And that's something that resonates a lot. So maybe like lots of players will just think, oh, that's interesting. But then there's more than that. It's actually both diasporic and post-colonial experience and theme that's there. And so I think there's a lot of like ways, even like smaller, little mechanics or themes that we can be working with. And it's like a spectrum overall.
And I'd just like to add, in terms of, I think Carl, we've all touched on it in different ways, in the sense of like even tabletop games. So I was talking about Kumiliki, whose publisher is Blue Rhino Group Limited in Nairobi. And the fact that there is a property type game that is in different Kenyan households that is being bought, that is changing the way we look at just being present, as much as it is consumerism, yes, it's capitalism, yes, it's all those things. But the idea that it's organically happening, that people are asking themselves, oh, okay, we have this, but how is this relevant to us? I think Carl, you mentioned about, things happening a little bit more organically on the continent. So I really think that is also a step forward, where the social impact is visibility of yourself, which does not happen as much in this type of spaces. And it doesn't have to be on a console. It actually is something that you can hold. So kind of expanding, and it's really great, Allan, to hear that your game is also a tabletop game. I want to play it. And I think it really opens up how we start to think about games, game consumption, and all the things that we've talked about so far, that we're not just trying to make sure we're seen in one place, so to speak, one form, mode of production.
You brought up an interesting point. Lindsay, is there any research done on the impact of tabletop gaming and the representation on like psychology? Like, people seeing themselves in a tabletop game in particular as a development cycle?
There are efficacy analyses, and this is the sort of a perfect opportunity to emphasize academia and the need for academia perhaps to bridge that gap. As Allan had said, that the expenses of getting a single peer-reviewed paper are so high that people don't necessarily grab them. But remember that as academics, we have libraries where we can help you access them. So you might want to work with us. But the questions, I think one of the challenges from an academic perspective, as faculty who's been tenured for years, is that we maybe need to make this more accessible and more widely accessible. So I produced a book that actually tells you how to use the mechanics for social impact, but the problem is it's a $75 book. And it shouldn't be a $5 book, but I have no control over what the publisher has decided to set the price at. But it's very explicitly, this is how we map mechanics to meaning, that I'd love for people to start thinking about in this context. And likewise, a lot of the peer-reviewed research on the change in people's psychology based on playing an analog or digital game are behind paywalls that cost a lot. And when you think about the economic difference across the globe, that it becomes even more expensive. $15 a paper in the US means a whole lot more if we're talking RMB, or we're talking ringgit, or we're talking whatever. So I think that's a larger systemic problem that could also be addressed as a whole panel. Before we kind of wrap up, as we're starting to run out of time, I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to sort of just, if you could kind of sum everything up that you would want to maybe deliver, or for an audience that's trying to understand this better, what's sort of one message or theme or idea that you would most like to leave the audience with? Maybe even if it's like a discussion starter.
Yeah, I can start that. This has been a wonderful panel, first of all, so thank you, Lindsay, for organizing, and thank you, everybody, for sharing this space. But I think one of the themes that came out in this panel is how do we affordably find ways for designers from the diaspora to get into the industry. And I think looking at these bottom-up movements is really amazing. In my research, I found that often it's not a AAA company that's doing the sort of like banner research on Black games. It's people who are making their own way and publishing on their own website and stuff. And there's just amazing stuff out there if you look.
So yeah, quick one. Then I feel like we're actually at the beginning of a renaissance. So I'm feeling very positive and very excited about what's coming next. Like from what I hear, what's happening out there in the industry. So I think it's the right time to support, and so you should support us and come and consume what we're doing. And just Google us, Black creators. There's a lot of interesting things happening both in the diaspora and on the continent.
I would just say imagine radically, and I think that's basically in different ways. And that's the mantra of Akoia and Company, is imagine radically. How we're accessing our audience, how we're building the stories, what mechanics are they using? Are they games? Are they location-based experiences? How are we bringing audiences? Are we outside the usual spaces? Are we in museums? Are we in cultural centers? So for me, it really is imagining radically. And Lindsay, I will be hitting you up for academic stuff. So now you know.
For me, it would be like a threefold answer, right? So the first would be those who are entrepreneurial, coming out of of new money, like especially people that are like under 50, because there is a gap between people who play games and this generation, people that the previous generation. So there's millionaires now that are gamers that were not millionaires before they were gamers. So fun game companies, fun ideas, like take your money, pool it, and say, okay, we're going to hire a good developer, and then let people try again to get a great game out there, right? Games need time and research to figure out if they're going to do it right. Secondly is we have to look at how games impact. So like, can we fund games to help people learn? Can we help fund games help people think about how the industry works? Can we fund games that help people think about different issues? And that can be profitable. It does not have to be a charitable approach. And I think a lot of times people think about causes, they think about them being charity only, versus like how to make an impactful game that makes people think. And I think this is where they can learn a lesson from filmmaking. Is there's often a lot of like creative films, not documentaries, that actually approach ideas from a development standpoint of telling an idea, and that idea having impact, but also being a profitable model, right? So that's the second thing. The third thing is, and I think this is important, is pooling our resources, right? Like saying, okay, this is what I think, and I'm gonna say this in a really radical way, is we don't have postgraduate game incubators for minorities. And this is, I think, the most critical part of game development is, if you're a game developer and you learn you want to do games in post high school, post college, where do you go? What do you do to get the time to learn your craft and to find resources that doesn't put you $100,000 within debt? And that is like the critical part, because countries all over the world have game incubators that are set up to help studios get created. And I've not seen an African diaspora version of that concept yet.
Great point on the third one. I've actually tried to pitch that one to funding agencies, so I'll keep doing that. I think we're out of time, so I just want to say thank you to everyone. And I think it's been a pleasure. I think it's been really great to hear these thoughts. I really appreciate everyone taking the time and sharing their candid thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.